You have until 6 this morning to disconnect from our community supply, or we will do it for you. That was the voicemail Diane Caldwell left on my phone at 11 the night before, and Diane was the president of the Stone Ridge Homeowners Association. And the water she was threatening to cut ran from my own well on my own deeded ground. Into a lie my grandfather laid before, there was a Stone Ridge, or a Diane, or a single one of those beige houses up on the ridge. What she did not know, what she never once thought to check in the 4 years she had been signing letters at me, was that the line she called, the community supply, was recorded in the county as a private water right in my family's name with my own engineering license number on the as-built drawing she had never read. So when her crew showed up at 6 with a valve key and a man in a fake inspector's vest, the only question left was how long it would take a sheriff's deputy to figure out who was actually breaking the law. If a stranger called your water community property and threatened to shut it off at dawn, what would you have done? My name is Walter Boyd. I am 63 years old. For 31 years, I was a licensed water systems engineer for the county utility district, and before that, I drilled wells with my father across 3 counties of high desert. And the place I am telling you about is a 40-acre spread at the foot of Ash Mountain that my family has held since 1941. There is a house, a barn, a stand of cottonwoods my wife planted, and a well house painted the same green my grandfather mixed by hand. My wife, Carol, died 4 years ago this spring. My daughter, May, was 13 then. She is 17 now, and she is the reason I keep telling the story plainly, instead of the way I sometimes want to tell it. The water is the whole story, so let me tell you about the water first. My grandfather drilled the original well in 1946, 320 feet, down into a good aquifer, and he did it himself with a cable tool rig he kept until the day he died. I have a photograph of him standing next to that rig with his sleeves rolled and his hands black to the wrist, squinting at the camera the way men did. Then, like the sun was a thing to be endured, he drilled for 11 days. He hit water on the 9th and kept going 2 more to be sure of it, because he did not trust a well that gave up easy. The casing he set is still down there. I have pulled the pump 4 times in my life and looked at that old steel and thought about the hands that set it. When the county started platting the slope above us in the 1970s, there was no municipal main up there, and the developer of that first subdivision asked my father if he would sell water off our well to the new houses until the district could run a line. My father said yes. He was a generous man and a careful one, which are 2 things that do not always live in the same body. He let them tap our line. Before he let them tap a single foot of it, though he drove to the county seat and recorded an easement and a water rights agreement that said in plain language what was ours and what was theirs. Our well, our water, our line, down to the property boundary, their pipe, their problem, from the boundary up. He paid a surveyor named Albert Voss to walk the whole line and pin the corners, and he paid a lawyer to write the agreement so tight that 50 years later, not 1 comma of it could be argued. I have the canceled checks for both. He kept the original in a fireproof box in the well house, and a certified copy in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, and he taught me to do the same with every document that ever crossed my hands. I was 9 years old the first time he took me to the recorder's office. I remember the smell of the place, ink and old paper and floor wax, and the way the clerk stamped a page, and it became, in that one motion, a thing the world had to agree was true. That is the thing about my family. We keep paper. We have always kept paper. My father used to say a fence can be moved in a night, but a recorded deed has to be killed in daylight, in front of a clerk, and nobody has the stomach for that. I did not fully understand him until I was older. I understand him now, so that is what was waiting under the surface when Diane Caldwell decided my well was hers. Now let me tell you how she got there, because she did not arrive all at once. Nobody overreaches all at once. They take the staircase. The first step came on a Tuesday in the spring 4 years back. A few weeks after Carol's funeral, when I was not at my best, and Diane must have known it. The casseroles were still coming, been left on the porch by women from the valley, and the house smelled of other people's kitchens. May had stopped talking much. She would sit at the table and move her food around and look out the window at the cottonwoods her mother had planted. And I did not know what to say to her. So, I mostly said nothing, which I have since learned is its own kind of mistake. Into that quiet came a white luxury SUV down my gravel with a vanity plate that read her own initials. And out of it stepped a woman in a linen blazer and white sneakers that had never touched dirt, holding a clipboard against her chest like a breastplate. She introduced herself as the president of the Stone Ridge Homeowners Association and told me my well house was out of compliance with community aesthetic standards. She said it the way a person reads a sentence they have read aloud many times before, looking not at me, but at the well house, at the fence, at the gravel, tallying. I remember I had a coffee mug in my hand, and I did not put it down. I told her my well house sat on my land, 400 feet outside her subdivision boundary, and was not part of any community of hers. Mr. Boyd, she said, and she said my name the way you say the name of a child who has tracked mud across a clean floor. The supply that serves our homes originates on this parcel, which makes this parcel functionally part of our jurisdiction. We can do this the easy way or the formal way. That was the first time I heard the phrase, functionally part of our jurisdiction. I would hear it again. I told her I would think about it, which was a lie, and she smiled like she had won something and clicked her pen and made a note on her clipboard. And she got back in the SUV and backed up over my wife's flower bed without seeming to notice. I went inside and wrote down the date, the time, the plate number, and the exact words she used on a legal pad I labeled Stone Ridge. May watched me do it from the table. She asked who that was. I told her it was nobody, just a neighbor with a complaint, and May looked at me the way her mother used to, like she could see the thing I was not saying, and she said, "You're writing it down, though." I told her I write everything down. She nodded and went back to the window. The next morning, though, she had pulled a clean spiral notebook out of her school bag and set it on the counter next to my legal pad without a word, and that was the first thing she had given me in weeks. That legal pad became a folder. That folder became a binder. By the end, it filled a banker's box, and the box is the reason I am the one telling you this, and she is the one explaining herself to a grand jury. I am getting ahead. That was Incident 1. Incident 2 came by mail. 11 days later. A notice of violation on Stone Ridge letterhead, citing my well house color, my fence height, and the gravel of my drive, with a fine of $200 and a demand to remit within 30 days. I drove to the county recorder's office, pulled the certified copy of our easement and the subdivision plat, and confirmed in writing what I already knew. My boundary was my boundary. The plat itself, drawn by the developer's own surveyor, showed the HOA's authority ending 400 feet north of my well house. I made 2 copies. One went in the binder. One I mailed back to Diane with a single line, that I owned my parcel free and clear, and held no membership in her association, and I kept the certified mail receipt. That receipt mattered later. I want to be honest about something. I was not calm, because I am a calm man by nature. I was calm because I was tired, and because Carol had been the one who handled people. And now there was no one to hand the people to, so I handled them the only way I knew how, which was the way you handle a failing pump. You do not yell at it, you measure it, you write down the readings, and you wait for it to show you the part that is broken. The fines kept coming. That was the middle of it, the long climb, and it went on for the better part of 2 years. A fine for the well house, a fine for a trailer I parked by the barn, a fine for cottonwood seeds blowing onto the road, as if I could be held to account for the wind. Each one arrived on the letterhead, embossed and official-looking, with a return address up in the subdivision, and a line at the bottom about late penalties accruing daily. Each one demanded money. Each one cited that same invented jurisdiction in slightly different words, as though her lawyer kept rephrasing it, hoping one version would finally be true. I never paid one. I answered every single one with the same certified letter and the same copy of the plat, and I drove to the post office in town to mail each one so the clerk would hand me the green receipt card, and I filed the receipts in order in a sleeve at the front of the binder. It became a kind of grim routine. The letter would come, usually on a Friday, and May would bring the mail up from the box and set the Stone Ridge envelope on top where I would see it, and she would say, "Number 8, or number 11, because she had started counting them too. We did not talk about it much beyond the count. The count was a thing we shared, though a way of standing together against it without having to find the words. And I think now that those envelopes did as much to bring my daughter back to me as anything did, because they gave us a common enemy at a time when grief had made us strangers in our own kitchen. By the second winter, the binder had a tab that read notices, and that tab held 19 of them. 19 fines, 0 paid, every refusal documented and mailed and receipted. I want you to hold that number, 19. Somewhere in that stretch, I learned why she cared so much about a well house she could not see from her road. I learned it from a man named Hank Ostler, who ran cattle on the section east of mine, and who had been at Stone Ridge's throat over a fence line of his own. Hank is a big, slow-talking man with a habit of saying half a thing and letting you wait for the rest. He stopped his truck at my gate one evening in the second autumn, the bed loaded with salt blocks, and let the engine idle, and asked if I knew that Diane's husband was the Caldwell in Caldwell Ridge development. I did not. Hank told me the company had optioned the raw 40 acres directly above the subdivision and filed paperwork to build 60 more homes up there, and that the whole project was dead in the water. For one reason, there was no water. The district main still had not reached the top of the slope. The only proven, permitted, producing water source within a mile was sitting 320 feet under my well house. That was the day the petty became clear. She did not want my well house repainted. She wanted my well. Hank told me one more thing before he drove off. He said the county had scheduled a hearing that next year on whether to approve the Caldwell Ridge expansion, and that the approval hinged on the developer proving an adequate water supply. He said it with the flat satisfaction of a man who had been waiting a long time to tell somebody. Then he said, "Walt, write all this down." And I told him I already had, and he laughed for the first time since Carol's funeral, which he had attended. Standing in the back in a clean shirt with his hat in his hands, and he put the truck in gear and drove off into the dusk with the salt blocks rocking in the bed. I went inside and added a tab. I labeled it Motive. Under it, I wrote the name of the development, the 60 homes, the optioned 40 acres, and the date of the hearing Hank had named. And I called the county the next morning to confirm the hearing was real and on the calendar, which it was. I was learning that the binder was not just a defense. It was a map, and the map showed exactly where she had to end up. The escalation widened after that. the way these things do once the money is showing through the paint. Diane stopped sending only letters. She started sending people. A man in a polo shirt and a lanyard knocked on my door one Saturday and announced he was conducting a compliance inspection of the community water infrastructure. He had a clipboard and a badge clipped to his belt, and the badge was the kind you order off the internet. Plastic and shiny, with a star that meant nothing and a word stamped under it that was not the name of any agency that exists. He had a measuring tape in one hand and an air about him, of a man playing a part he had practiced in the mirror. I asked him for his credential and the statute he was inspecting under. He said he was authorized by the Homeowners Association to inspect the supply. I told him the Homeowners Association did not own the supply and could not authorize him to stand where he was standing. I asked him again for the statute. He looked at his clipboard as if the answer might be written there. It was not. He said he would have to report my refusal to cooperate. I told him he was standing on private property without permission, and that I would be recording the rest of our conversation. And I took out my phone and did exactly that. And I narrated the date and the time and the fact that he wore a badge with no agency on it out loud for the recording. The color went out of his face. He folded his tape, said I would be hearing about this, and walked back to his car a good deal faster than he had walked up. The footage saved to 2 drives that night, the way my father saved everything in 2 places, and the clip went into the binder. Under a tab I labeled Fake Inspector. That was a Saturday in March. I stamped it. The customers came next, except I did not have customers. So what she went after instead were the 4 downhill neighbors who still ran a garden hose off the old shared spur my father had allowed, decades back, a courtesy never revoked. Diane sent each of them a letter saying their water came from an unpermitted illegal source and that they should disconnect immediately or face liability. 3 of them were frightened enough to call me one after another on a Tuesday evening, their voices tight, asking if they were going to be sued, asking if they had done something wrong by drinking water. Their families had drunk for 30 years. I told each of them the same thing, that the water was legal, that the letter was not, and that they should send it to me and otherwise do nothing. The 4th, a retired schoolteacher named Ruth Maddox, was angry enough to drive down with a letter in her fist and ask me what in the world was going on. She is a small woman, late 70s, sharp as a tack, the kind who taught 2 generations of Valley children to diagram a sentence and does not suffer a bully. I made coffee. I sat her at the kitchen table, and I showed her the recorded easement, the plat, the readings, the whole binder. I told her the water she had drunk for 30 years was as legal as rain. Ruth read every page with her glasses down on her nose, turning each one carefully and setting it square on the stack before she took up the next, the way she must have graded 1,000 papers. When she finished, she took her glasses off and looked at me and said, "Walter, this woman is not confused. A confused person stops when you show her the deed. This one is going to keep coming because she is not after your well house. She is after your water." I told her I had reached the same conclusion. Ruth tapped the letter on the table and said she would swear to all of it in front of anyone who asked, judge, deputy, or the devil himself. I asked her to write down what the letter said when it came. She did better than that. She slid the letter across the table and told me to keep the original, that she had read it enough times to recite it. It went in the binder. Another tab. Another date. Before she left, she stopped at the door and said, "Your father would be proud of how you're keeping this." I had to look at the floor for a moment after she said that. I called the sheriff's office around then, not to file against anyone, but to ask a plain question, because I could feel the thing accelerating, and I wanted to know where the lines were. A deputy named Sam Reyes came out. He was maybe 40, calm, the kind of officer who reads the whole scene before he says anything. I laid it out for him at the kitchen table the way I am laying it out for you. He listened. Then, he told me something I have repeated to a dozen people since. He said that when somebody files a complaint, his office has to respond to it, whether the complaint has merit or not, because that is how the law works and how it protects everybody, including me. He said that if Diane called and claimed I was stealing community water, a deputy would have to come out and take it seriously in the moment, and that the way I protected myself was not to argue on the gravel, but to have the documented pattern ready dated and recorded so that the truth could be verified instead of debated. He said, "Build the record, Mr. Boyd. Get me to where I can see it in one folder, and I can act on it in 5 minutes instead of 5 weeks. Then he looked at the binder on my counter, already 3 inches thick, and he said, "Looks like you already have." I want to be clear about Sam Reyes, because the easy version of this story makes the police into villains, and that is not what happened. And not what I will say. Sam was not on my side that afternoon. He was on the side of the facts, and he told me plainly that until the facts were in front of him in a form he could verify, his hands were tied by the same rules that would later free them. That is not corruption. That is the system working slowly the way it is built to. The lesson, if you want it early, is that the slowness is survivable if you spend it documenting. The winter of the 3rd year is when she crossed the line, not bent it. It was a Thursday in February, cold enough that the stock tank had a skin of ice, and May was home from school with a sore throat, asleep upstairs under 2 quilts. At a little after 6 in the morning, before the light was even up over Ash Mountain, I heard an engine on the gravel, and then another. And then the squeal of the gate I keep chained. Metal dragging against metal. I had been standing at the counter with a fresh cup of coffee, the first of the day, watching the dark out the kitchen window. I set the cup down. I came out in my coat with a flashlight and found 2 trucks in my drive, headlights blazing into the dark. A man at my well house with a long valve key already seated in the curb stop, and Diane Caldwell standing in the headlights in a hot pink coat with her arms crossed. Watching a 3rd man cut the chain on my gate with a pair of bolt cutters, the chain fell into the gravel with a sound I still hear. Mr. Splann. "Boyd," she called out, pleasant as a hostess greeting a guest. "We are reclaiming the community supply. You have made this necessary." The board voted. I did not run at them. 40 years of standing next to high-pressure systems teaches you that the worst thing you can do at the dangerous moment is move fast. A man who panics at a wellhead is a man who loses a hand. I stood in my own headlights and I took out my phone and started recording, and I narrated it as I went. The date, the time, the cut chain, the trucks, the valve key, and my curb stop. All of it out loud and steady. And then I said in a voice I kept as level as I could that they were on private property, that the well and the line were mine on a recorded right, and that the man at the curb stop was about to commit a crime in front of a camera. The man at the valve hesitated. He looked at Diane. His hand stayed on the key, but it did not turn. "Turn it," she told him. "It is ours." He turned it. The valve groaned, and my well went silent. The steady hum I had heard every morning of my life gone all at once, and 400 feet up the hill, and 4 houses down the spur, the water stopped, including the water to my own kitchen. That was the moment the bank thing in me wanted to come out. I felt it climb into my hands and my jaw. I did not let it. I called the sheriff instead, and I asked for Sam Reyes by name, and I held the phone up so the dispatcher could hear Diane on my property saying the word "ours." on the record, at 6 in the morning, with my chain cut on the ground. May's light came on in the upstairs window. While I stood there, I saw it out of the corner of my eye, a small yellow square in the gray. And I think that light is what broke the man with the bolt cutters, though I did not know it yet. Here's what I learned later about that morning, and I learned it from the man with the bolt cutters himself, who turned out to have a conscience after all. His name was Trent, and he worked for Caldwell Ridge Development. And Diane had told him and the others that the HOA had legal authority to recover an asset, and that a county permit was on the way. There was never any permit. Trent told all of this weeks later in a sworn statement, because he had a daughter of his own and he could not stop thinking about the light that came on in my upstairs window while he stood there holding the chain he had just cut. That all came later. That morning what happened was that Deputy Reyes arrived in 11 minutes, and he found a cut chain, 2 trucks, a shut valve, a man with bolt cutters, and a woman in a pink coat telling him that she was the president of the Homeowners Association. 3 times now I had heard that phrase. Sam heard it once, and I watched his face while he heard it, and I watched him ask Diane one question, which was whether she had a court order or a permit authorizing entry and disconnection. She did not. She told him she did not need one because the supply was community property. Sam asked her if she had documentation of that. She gestured at me and said the documentation was a technicality. Sam Reyes had been a neutral man on my gravel for 3 visits running. He was still neutral. Neutral, though, when the facts finally land in front of it, looks a great deal like taking a side. He told everyone to step away from the well house. He told the man to remove the valve key. And he told me, quietly, that he needed to see the folder. I want to slow down here because this is the part that matters most, and the profile of my whole life had been pointing at it without my knowing. I went inside. May was at the top of the stairs in her blanket, pale and scared, and I told her it was all right, that the people who cut the gate were about to find out whose ground they were standing on, and she came down and stood beside me because she did not want to be alone, and because I think she wanted to see it. I took the binder off the counter. Then I took the fireproof box out of the wellhouse cabinet, the original box, my grandfather's box, and I carried both out into the gray morning light where Sam was waiting and Diane was still talking. I did not make a speech. My father did not raise me to make speeches at people. I set the box on the hood of the deputy's truck, and the metal was cold and beaded with the morning damp, and I opened it, and the smell that came up out of it was the smell of the recorder's office from when I was 9, ink and old paper. I took out the original recorded easement and water rights agreement stamped by the county recorder in 1976, and the as-built drawing of the line with my own engineering license number printed in the corner, and the certified plat showing the HOA boundary ending 400 feet north of where we stood. I laid them on the hood, one at a time, in order, the way you lay out tools before a job. May stood at my shoulder with her blanket around her and watched me do it. Then I stepped back and I let the paper do the talking. Sam Reyes read the easement first. He is a careful reader. I watched his eyes go down the page to the legal description and the recording stamp and the signature, my grandfather's signature, in fountain pen, dated half a century back. Then he looked at the as-built and the license number, and then back at me, because the license number on that drawing was mine, and he understood in that moment that the man whose well they had come to seize was a licensed water systems engineer, who had spent 31 years certifying the legality of exactly this kind of line. Then he looked at the plat and the boundary line, and he turned slowly and looked 400 feet up the slope to where Diane's subdivision actually began. The first beige roof line, just catching the light coming over Ash Mountain. The whole thing took maybe 90 seconds. Nobody spoke. There was no sound but the wind in Carol's cottonwoods, and the tick of the cooling truck engine, and once the distant complaint of a crow. Then Sam folded the plat along its old crease, set it back on the hood, and turned to Diane Caldwell. "Ma'am," he said, "this is his well on his land, on a recorded right that predates your subdivision by 20 years. You cut his gate and you closed his valve. That is not a code dispute. That is criminal trespass and tampering, and you did it on his camera." Diane said the supply was functionally part of her jurisdiction. She said it the fourth time, and the fourth time, it sounded like what it had always been, which was a woman saying a magic word and being amazed it no longer worked. The numbers, when they came out, were the whole case in 2 figures. In 4 years, Diane Caldwell had issued me 19 fines and collected, from me, a total of $0. In one cold morning, she had ordered the cutting of a chain and the closing of a valve on a water right, recorded 49 years earlier, witnessed, dated, and signed, 19 and 0 on one side. 49 years and one signature on the other. A deputy could point at both, and so could anyone in that county hearing room later. And the gap between them was the entire distance between performance and ownership. Sam did not arrest her in my driveway. That is not how it works. And the story where he slaps the cuffs on in the headlights is a story for people who have never watched the real thing. What he did was take the original documents into evidence with my permission, take Trent's name and the other man's name, photograph the cut chain and the seated valve key, and tell Diane Caldwell that she would be hearing from the county and very likely from the district attorney. Then he told a man to open my valve back up, and the man did. And somewhere up the hill, the water came back, and in my own kitchen, the tap coughed and ran, and May went and filled the kettle just to watch it fill. The coffee I had poured at 5:45 that morning, before any of it started, was still sitting on the counter. It was not even cold yet. I remember thinking that they had cut my gate, shut my well, and lost their whole scheme in the time it takes a cup of coffee to cool. And the only reason it went that fast was the folder. What happened to Caldwell Ridge happened the way water always finds the low ground, which is to say on its own, by gravity, without my pushing it. The county hearing on the 60-home expansion came that spring in a low brick building in town with folding chairs and a dais and a pitcher of water sweating on the table. I was there, in the back, with Ruth Maddox beside me, in her good coat, and May on my other side and the binder on my lap. Hank Osler came too and stood along the back wall with his hat in his hands. I did not have to say much. The developer's representative, a polished young man in a suit that cost more than my truck, stood up and presented the project with a slide deck full of rooftops and cul-de-sacs. And when the commission asked him to prove an adequate and legally secured water supply for 60 new homes, he talked about a pending arrangement. He talked about a community supply. The chairwoman, an older woman who had clearly read her packet, asked him to identify the source on the record. He could not, because the supply he had been quietly counting on for 4 years was a private, well, he did not own, recorded to a family that had refused him 19 times, and the proof of all of it was sitting in a sheriff's evidence locker, along with a chain. The commission tabled the project. Without water, it could not be approved, and there was no water, and there had never been any water that was his to promise. Then the district attorney's office did its part, and that part was not mine to run, so I will tell it short the way it deserves. Diane Caldwell was charged with criminal trespass, tampering with a private utility, and filing false documents, those being the 19 notices that claimed an authority she knew she did not have. Trent gave his statement, and it was a good one, honest about his own part, which is the only kind worth anything. The HOA board, looking at the liability, voted Diane out of the presidency she had held for 6 years, and the new board sent every one of those 4 downhill neighbors a letter withdrawing the disconnection threats. Caldwell Ridge Development lost its option on the upper 40 when the financing fell through behind the tabled approval. She had reached for my water to build her husband's 60 houses, and in reaching, she lost the houses, the option, the presidency, and a good deal more that the court is still sorting out. The flood she aimed at me fell on her own ground. I did not do that to her. She did it to herself, 400 feet outside a boundary she never bothered to read. I want to bring this back down to my kitchen, because that is where it started, and that is where it should end, before I step out and tell you the plain part. A week after the hearing, May and I repainted the well house. Same green. I still had the formula my grandfather mixed, written on the inside of the cabinet door in pencil, and we matched it. May did the trim. She is a careful painter, more careful than I am, and while she worked, she asked me if I had been scared that morning with the trucks in the drive. I told her the truth, which was that I had been, but that scared and prepared can live in the same body, the way generous and careful lived in my father, and that the trick is to let the prepared one hold the brush. She thought about that. Then she asked if Grandpa Boyd really dug the well himself, 320 feet down, and I said he did, with a cable tool and his own 2 hands, and that the water we were standing on had been in our family longer than the state had been keeping the records that saved us. She nodded and went back to the trim. Carol's cottonwoods moved in a wind above us. The valve was open, the kettle was full. The folder was back in the drawer where it belonged. So here is the lesson, the way I would give it to a neighbor across a fence because somebody gave it to me. And I am only passing it on. If you own your ground, know what you own. Drive to the county recorder and pull your deed, your easement, your plat, and read them until you understand every line, because the day you need them is not the day to learn them. Keep your paper. Keep it in 2 places, one of them fireproof. When somebody in a blazer tells you that your land is functionally part of their jurisdiction, do not argue with them on the gravel. Write down the date, the time, and the exact words, and put it in a folder and start a record, because a record is the one thing a clipboard cannot beat. Answer every false notice in writing and keep the receipt. Talk to your neighbors, because the person being harassed today is your best witness tomorrow. And if it ever comes to a cold morning with a cut chain and a stranger at your valve, do not give them the fight they came for. Give them the camera, give them the calm, and give the deputy the folder. The folder wins. It won for me 49 years after my grandfather signed his name, and it will win for you too if you keep it. If you have a story like this one, a fence, a well, a gate, a boundary somebody tried to take, put it down in the comments. I read them, and there are more of us than you think. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because next week I am going to tell you about a woman 3 valleys over who came home to find an HOA had paved a road across her pasture while she was burying her mother, and what she found in her father's gun safe. Until then, know what you own. Keep your paper. And keep the kettle full.